Hello and welcome to Conversations with Elders, a podcast that is supported by Aephoria Partners. My name is Makgathi Mokwena, and I am very happy to be hosting this podcast where I get to have conversation with people that I regard as elders. And eldership really, it's a designation that I see as being held by people who are custodians of indigenous knowledges, some wisdom, some expanded understandings that we can benefit from. And this podcast today, we are going to be having a conversation. I'm going to be having a conversation with a very dear friend of mine, Simon Whitesman. This isn't our first conversation. In fact, we've had one early on at the beginning of lockdown, where we spoke about loss. And it feels like, even though we're not speaking about loss today, we are going to speak about suffering and about how to cultivate space for joy within suffering. It feels like a continuation of a theme in some ways. But before I go too far into my conversation, Simon, let me welcome you and thank you for giving this time. For this
Hello, Makgathi.
Hello.
Lovely to see you and be with you as ever. There's always an immediacy of a bubbling joy, actually, if I can use that, when I see you and when we engage. So happy to be with you and to continue the conversation, wherever it may lead.
Absolutely.
It always feels a little bit like we stepping back into the river. We don't quite know which part of the river we're stepping back to, but we know that we're stepping into the river.
Absolutely. And this is why I love having these conversations with you, because you're absolutely right. I often sit and I grapple with, okay, now how do I position this? How do I phrase this? But actually, I know I don't have to, because we do get carried by the flow, and I trust completely in the flow. Before we get going, Simon, please can I ask you to take us through a very brief, quick centering exercise that will help us land in the space of our conversation.
With pleasure. So wherever you are, just to simply recognize that your body is inhabiting this physical space. Whether you're sitting somewhere at home or in a car listening while you're driving, just recognizing, acknowledging that the body is being held in a particular configuration, either sitting or standing, maybe even lying down. And under the influence of gravity, you're not floating away, even though your mind might be. So just recognizing momentarily the planes of contact between the body and the surface behind and beneath you, whatever the posture you're in at this moment. So the effect of gravity moving us down into contact with the surface on which we're sitting, if we are sitting, or standing, if we're standing. We can notice the plane of contact between body and surface. That's slight pressure, touch, contact. And if you have your feet on the ground, you might also notice this plane of contact between the feet and the surface beneath. And so simply coming into a noticing, into an awarenessing of this subtle contact between body and surface, body and chair, body and cushion, body and seat, body and floor, body and earth. We are inviting this quality of groundedness to make itself known, being in and down within the body, and inviting the mind, which tends to wander, to come and join the body. inhabiting the posture you're in and inhabiting the body you're in, just as it is, and just now. Perhaps if you'd like, and you feel that would be helpful, to take a deeper than normal breath through the nostrils. Feeling the expansion through the chest and maybe the upper abdomen, and then for a moment pause, and then slow, soft exhale, long, slow out breath. Seeing how the out breath invites us further to come in and down into this embodied moment. So here we are.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. When you used the word embodied, it landed inside of me as an experience, as a memory, an experienced memory. So thank you very much for that. And I think that it sort of brings me certainly to this conversation that we're going to have today, which is, I mean, we are in the world that is filled with dualities right now, with experiences of deep pain, and but alongside it, there's also this call for a lifting, for an arising, for an ascension. And I see that very evident in my own life, where I feel like I'm constantly having to skate on a sharp edge of too much and not enoughness, of how do I hold the space of love. These are examples of the dualities. How do I hold the space that is within me of love and receiving love, and at the same time of yearning for it? How do I hold inside of me the deep pain that is experienced by people that look like me with what's happening in the world right now, and at the same time give myself permission to hold another view, to hold another something else that says that this isn't all, even though people that look like me are experiencing a huge amount of pain right now and have been for the longest time, but there are other experiences as well. How do I allow myself to open up to both and not feel like it's a betrayal? So in other words, how do I step within the space of suffering, my own and the suffering of the other, and also still open up a window, a door, a shaft of light to joy, and dare I say bliss?
So my first response is I have no idea. Just feeling into the question and the feeling behind the question around the suffering in the world, the personal suffering, if we're talking about race or illness or death or upheaval or whatever its form. It feels in the immediacy just overwhelming. Like where do I even start? How do I start? Because it feels complex and layered and loaded and charged and wound in with so many things. So the first wave is I don't know. A story comes to mind that was relayed to me by teachers of mine, which is a story about their teacher. So I'm going to maybe start there because it's informative. And their teacher was from the Buddhist tradition, lineage, particularly known as the Thai forest tradition. His name was Ajahn Chah. He was a highly evolved being and came out of the rural hinterland of, I think, northern Thailand. And so he wasn't highly educated, but he had a rustic, earthy wisdom. So his awakening, his self-realization was infused with more kind of earthy teachings rather than highfalutin teaching, which is very interesting. And these teachers, Kitty Sarant and Isra, were students of his for many years and lived within that tradition as a nun and as a monk, interestingly, until they met and got married and decided. They continued to teach, but they got derobed and they married. That's for another story.
Yes.
It's not the story, but it's a good story nonetheless.
It's a very good story.
So the story, which is like, talk about a preamble, the story is that Ajahn Chah was walking with his monks in the morning, doing the alms round. So the monks would take their begging bowls, as was the ritual, and walk from village to village. And we call it alms. It's not begging in any sense of neediness. There's an implicit appreciation that the monks are doing a particular kind of work, and the community supports them in feeding them. So they take their begging bowl, they took their bowls, and they're walking from village to village. So, and this is often where Ajahn Chah used to do his best teaching. So they were walking one day from one village to the next, and they happened to be walking past a hill, and dotted on the top of the hill were these huge boulders. So he stopped the monks and he said, and he pointed up at the boulders, he says, "Monks, are those boulders heavy?" And they all were like quite delighted, because usually he asked them questions that they couldn't answer. So they were quite chuffed. If you know, I don't know what chuffed is in Thai, but they were chuffed. So they could, oh yes. So they said, "Well, of course those boulders are heavy, master." And he said, "No, they're not. They're only heavy if you try and pick them up." They're only heavy if you try and pick them up. Which, the first time I heard that story, it was like, I was like that, those monks, it was like, of course they're heavy. And then this subtle yet profound reorientation, which invited, it's not about the boulders or their inherent weight, it's about how you are in relationship to them that determines their heaviness. In other words, the suffering that would come from trying to lift one up.
Right. So what I'm getting from that is that there will always be boulders, and what I do, exactly what you're saying, whether I pick them up or not, really will determine my experience of them. I can experience them visually by looking at them, or I can try and pick them up and then collapse under their weight.
And even more significant than that is that we're often lifting up boulders without even knowing that we're doing that, or that by doing so, that is causing suffering. So it's a kind of unintentional blindness to what is causing that weight to carry around. So we don't even know that there's even a choice in the matter.
Right.
We don't know about this plane of contact, just like the plane of contact with the ground when I'm sitting, this plane of contact with our suffering, we have no idea what it actually is. So we don't know how to become skillful or come into skillful, wise, and compassionate relationship with those boulders, which you're born into a human body, mind, you will have boulders. It doesn't matter if you have the most heinous, difficult childhood or the most adaptive, there will be boulders. Some of them small, some of them large. this, I love this teaching because it's so visual and so accessible. It doesn't go into kind of anything other than the obvious.
Yeah.
How am I holding, or do I even know whether I'm holding, and trying to lift up boulders?
You see, my experience is that there is a sort of, there's a way we are with one another in the world that says that of course we have to pick up these boulders, particularly if you see that the suffering is within the space of another, within the body, within the psyche, within it's, you know, there's the thing of you can't just look at suffering and not try and interact. I don't know whether it necessarily means that we have to lift the boulders. And maybe the question is, what is our response? What is called to us when we are in the space of suffering?
And it seems that what you're pointing to is what happens when I'm encountering somebody else who's suffering. You know, how am I moved to respond? So, you know, my response, which is, let me just say, not my response, my reaction would be, don't let me carry it for you. Which it doesn't help, because then I land up carrying it, and they, you know, there might be good reasons, and they might be left kind of a bit like confused, and I land up carrying. So you might have a different reaction to somebody else's suffering. That is my conditioned one, the so-called wounded healer, that is trying to make everybody else better by kind of, you know, carrying the cross.
Right.
As I think it was actually somebody called Simon who tried to carry the cross when Jesus was walking to the, you know, where he was about to be crucified. So, you know, I'm not, that's one way. So that's a reaction, that's a patterning, which is actually a defensive posture. So how can I respond when I witness my own suffering or the suffering of another, which is both wise and compassion? I mean, this is the golden chalice of spiritual and psychological healing, is seeing suffering, being moved by suffering, and reducing suffering, both my own and the other. It's not like if your suffering reduced but mine is increased, that's missing a trick. Right. And it's interesting because the word compassion is something about like standing with the suffering of others.
Standing with, calm.
It's also, you could say, being with, being moved by, which is different from reacting to. It might lead to an action, but the action will always be different when first I'm being with and standing with and being moved by the suffering of others, and then acting, as opposed to reacting right from the get-go based on my own wounding, which is more likely to make the suffering worse, either mine or somebody else's.
So what I'm hearing you say is actually the lesson for us is learning how to be with our own suffering and the suffering of the other. And perhaps when we can be with it without running away, without trying to shy away from it, that perhaps then when we are able to do that, we can be still enough to hear the guidance that can then tell us what our response should be, rather than us reacting and then following the guidance of ego, which has its own agenda and says, you know, act like this. So there's two different things there.
Yeah, it's there's a deeper whisper, which is generally much softer in voice. There's which is the response. And that's so important, I think, to emphasize it, because I think it's so easily misunderstood, especially in the world of activism, which is, you know, a kind of social awareness, which is a call to action. And I would say that there's quite a strong difference between a call to action and a call to reaction.
Mm.
Like being a reactivist as opposed to being an activist has something to do with the initial capacity to be with the suffering. And you can feel it and see it. I mean, we see it all the time. I watch wise responses to the suffering. I mean, it doesn't matter where you look. It's like this, you don't have to look far. You can see action, which is reaction, and you can see action, which is skillful action. You know, what's going on in the States at the moment, right? It actually, sometimes I actually feel sick, literally, physically sick, watching and witnessing the reaction. So to be with, it's almost what I would say, if I look at my own experience, it's like developing suffering tolerance, like a fitness to be with a little bit more before I do something, which means I've got to hold and be with and allow and acknowledge the we talk about suffering, but really the subjective experience, it feels unpleasant, uncomfortable, painful, noxious, aversive, traumatic, constricting, restricting, deflating. You know, all of these are different descriptors that describe this kind of ineffable non-thing called suffering. But if I could start to refine the way that I view, the way that I see, then my sense is that the tolerance capacity widens and deepens just a little bit more.
Yeah.
And in that space that it opens up, that is the awareness that is starting to infuse and carry. Then there's just a little bit more of the space and a little bit less of the content, which is usually charged affect, like charged emotion associated with self-righteous belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, but what I want, what's coming up for me, particularly when I look at the stuff that's happening in the States and actually throughout. And it is absolutely the strife that's happening, you know, across race, across gender, across. But when I look at when there's a perpetrator and there is somebody who is the recipient of the perpetration, the victim, often my question is, the perpetrator, what is going on there? What is the unacknowledged suffering there that is so intense that it has to be projected out because there is no space for it within? So all of that has to be projected out and acted out onto the body of another. And so the giving of permission to self to perpetrate as an attempt to alleviate suffering, unacknowledged suffering.
Yeah, well, I mean, you used the word project. So like whatever suffering is inside me, if I can project it onto another body, then I don't have to in any way come into contact with it. What I don't see is that that's lifting up a boulder and then trying to toss it on top of you. So it's still whether the perpetrator or the victim, or whether whatever the relational dynamic, it still involves lifting up a boulder. If it's to throw it at you or to carry it myself, it presupposes a failure to see and look honestly at what my current relationship is with suffering, and I'm starting with my own. And of course that is the, you know, we often talk about, you know, waking up as the primary spiritual inflection, but we also have to grow up.
Yeah.
And growing up involves dealing with our psychological, emotional, relational wounds of childhood. our trauma in short, and not bypass it. And this is where the spiritual and the psychological practices and worlds can really support each other in this being with and developing this kind of increased tolerance to be with ourselves. And it's quite practical. It's not like high concept, highfalutin, abstract. Like in any moment when a difficult state of mind arises, or a difficult physical experience, or a different emotional, usually they come together as a kind of interplay. There was an elder who I was in a sitting group with. She wouldn't have called herself, the true mark of an elder is one who doesn't say they're an elder. They're not an elder when they say, yeah, I'm the elder, and I'm the elder in the room. She was a pucker elder. She was in a mid to late 80s, and she was this feisty, wise, neurotic, funny woman. And we had a sitting meditation group. We used to meet every few weeks, and she always used to say, listen to me very carefully. Bless the obstacle. Bless the obstacle. Because we don't actually know this arising of the suffering if we could find a way to come into wise, compassionate relationship with it, what gifts it might bring for ourselves and others. So if I can start to take that orientation in some way, then when I'm having difficult states of body, mind, just for a moment more to be with, to allow, to let that be as it is, and see what is called for next. I see that all the time. I've had it especially in the last few months. It's like the intensity of trying to get away from our own difficult mental states or different physical states. It's really quite staggering, despite all the work, that so-called work that I do on myself. And then I had this moment this morning. I was doing some yoga stretching, and I actually remembered Hannah's words, bless the obstacle. And I can say to you, Makgathi, instantly, Makgathi, I could feel this shift from heaviness to lightening. Instant. Was a change in orientation of non-resistance, like let it be. It was so striking. My whole mood, my whole orientation, my whole percent, it was literally from one moment to the next just shifted.
You know what my difficulty is when I encounter that obstacle, that challenge. And I delve into the archives of my experience, of my past experience, and I'm like, fuck, I've carried this for so long.
Yeah.
It has been my companion for so long. And then a part of me then zooms past me and looks way into my future. And I despair because I feel like this is going to be an eternity, stretched infinitely into even other lifetimes. And it feels like that. And so inside of me, that's the thing that happens. And so of course I collapse because it just feels like I'm just caught in this thing, regardless of what it is. And I think that when we look at race relations, I think that often is the experience. I think part of what you were referring to, with what's happening and what's been happening with the protests in America and the expression that it has taken, I think at some point people look back and they're like, for fuck's sakes, we've been enslaved for eons. And then looking all the way. And it's like, but how can our identity as people of color continue to be derogated, to be suppressed, to be put down, to be oppressed, It feels like this is infinite. The only way, instead of collapsing, the only way that is an energized way of responding or reacting is by trying to push away the boulder.
Yeah. I recently watched 13th on Netflix. For those who haven't watched, it's about it's extraordinary documentary. It should be mandatory viewing for every white person in the world. It's about the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, which is the abolition of slavery, which actually says next to the literally there's a line that says, you are, hereby restored to all your rights, except if you're a criminal. And how that line in the 13th Amendment has been institutionalized for people of color with black bodies. Yeah. And this is the base of institutional racism, certainly in the States and way beyond. It's like having a big fat boulder removed from our eye. So that is like, we need to help remove the boulders in our eye, the big sticks, the sharp sticks, because we're not seeing clearly. All of this, all of this is a result of the failure to see clearly. And the failure to see clearly is a result of, in this, maybe I'm being a hell of a oversimplistic, is a result of self-righteousness. Mm. And self-righteousness, of course, is implicit in self-righteousness is an othering, and implicit in othering is separation. So one piece around that, and this can be a bit too abstract, but I love it because my kind of source of solace around this is that the word suffering in Pali, which is the ancient language of the Buddha, ancient language of India, is dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A, which is not an Egyptian salt that you rub on your roast chicken. Well, it is that too, but it's not the one I'm talking about. That's not dukkha, that's yummy.
Yes, that's yummy.
Okay. So dukkha is translated as unsatisfactoriness, sometimes as suffering. And there are a number of derivations and associations of that word. Unsatisfactoriness is the stress, distress, trauma, all these different possibilities. I heard one person say it's like in ancient India when they moved around on these wooden horse-drawn or donkey-drawn carts, and one of the cogs in the wheel was broken, and it would go duk, duk, duk. It would make the sound. So it doesn't matter. Like, you'd always have the sense, doesn't matter how good things are, that there was a duk. I call it the princess and the pea syndrome. No matter how many mattresses of comfort you got, you can still feel the fucking pea.
It's the stone in the shoes, the pebble in the shoes.
Yeah. Okay, so I love that. And then a few years ago, the same teacher who told me about Achancha, the same teachers, said the root of that word is not the root of the Pali word is Sanskrit, which is the most ancient language after cuneiform, but it's also not just it was a language which described reality with these rishis who sat contemplating the nature of reality. So Sanskrit is quite an extraordinary language in that respect. So dukkha in Sanskrit is the aggregation of two Sanskrit words, du and ka, D-U and K-H-A. And K-H-A, I think I have this right. I ain't no Sanskrit scholar. Ka means wholeness or the whole. And du means apart from. So dukkha means apartness or apart from wholeness or apart from whole. And whenever that shows itself as apart from whole, suffering is what is experienced and revealed.
Sure. That is the gift to me for this conversation. It just went right into me. Yeah. And I think at the beginning we spoke about duality, and you've just brought it all, but we've come back, and we've come back to a different space which speaks of perhaps because we are all on different journeys at different points along our journeys, that perhaps some of us have learned to be with suffering, and some of us, it's still very new to us. And what we are doing is picking up the boulder and throwing it at somebody else because we feel so threatened by the presence of the boulder.
The wise one would have equal compassion for the one doing the projecting.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean they wouldn't act.
Yeah.
But there's suffering in both. It's just more obvious with the one who's getting a boulder dropped on his head or her head, as opposed to the one doing the throwing that feels like, they're the victim, so they're the perpetrator, so they're not suffering. But, and I suppose the thing that comes up for me is, how do we make this into a practice?
Right.
So it doesn't remain in the domains of some elusive and reified or rarefied teaching that is accessible to very few. And I think the first thing is like a willingness, almost like a willingness to experiment in any given moment, to let whatever is arising as sensation, as feeling, emotion, and as thoughts be as they are. It's actually not more complicated than that. How do we become not apart from the whole by that which is not apart from the whole, which is the whole itself, which is awareness, which is accessible to us as presencing? That has no interest in trying to change the suffering into non-suffering. It doesn't have an interest in that. It allows the suffering, whatever its form, to be itself, and in that being is the revealing, is the healing, is the disidentification, is the letting go, all of it. So like the build of fitness, if we had one more moment from now until we die, one more moment in which we went, I'm not going to go into battle with this difficult state of mind body. I'm just going to let it be and see what happens. Then I don't know what would happen, but it would be very interesting.
Well, I think something different will happen, because I know that I bring on my own suffering by regurgitating the same story, the same perceived origin of my own suffering, and I retell it over and over. It's an interesting thing, because I retell myself, I relive the same story, but at the same time, whilst running away from the emotions that it brings, from the difficulty that it brings. So it's this funny, strange relationship of being almost obsessive about retelling it to myself, but then at the same time turning away from it. I'm my own crazy maker.
Yes, I can relate. It's like, my goodness. And then I find myself like searching outside of myself for something or someone who's just going to tell me it's okay and it's going to make it better, which is the same kind of projection. It's just an idealized projection rather than a de-idealized one, but it's the same process. So yeah, I'm my own crazy maker. Oh my goodness. But if I'm my crazy maker, then I must have the polarity too. Freedom maker.
Yes.
This is where it gets interesting because, I suppose no exploration or discussion about spirituality is complete unless we use the word letting go.
No, well.
Probably the most misunderstood, misapprehended, confusing phrase.
Mm.
Easy for the mind to make something of that which it is not. Because you say this, like this kind of archive, as you say, that this me, the story of me, spiraling on and galloping forward into an infinite future of like lack of freedom. I mean, we all must have had these moments. Everybody who's listening has had a moment of, I don't, just call it letting go for now. I got that freedom in that. So what is it that's happening? What is happening? Is that quality cultivatable? And letting, for me, the words can help and hinder in equal measure. For me, the phrase letting go implies two things: doing, got to let go, and me, I've got to let go. So really, we've got two problems. Not surprising that it's quite tricky.
Right.
Yeah. So what I've tried and work when I remember, because I forget all the time, but when I remember, is to shift the languaging internally from letting go to letting be.
Yeah.
Because letting be, there's no doing in it. It's just allowing it and me and whatever is right to be. And then the being itself is awareness itself, and in which there is a subtle but significant disidentification from the me that is trying to let go. As Adyashanti, the spiritual teacher, says, the ego is not interested in letting go, nor is it interested in waking up. It's going to do its everything, and it's not wrong or bad. It's just like, we get through the world through, an egoic mind. It has its place, but we should not mistake that egoic mind, the thinking mind, as that which is going to let go. It doesn't let go. It can't let go. It's not its nature.
Right.
That's why letting go becomes a bit kind of fudgy and confusing.
I understand that. I understand that. Yeah, yeah. Just before we close, because I think that we must close. Earlier you were saying something about, now I have to remember, my aged brain is a sieve. You were just before you spoke about the letting go. Oh, I can't remember. But I had this realization in me of, you were talking about practical, how, the praxis of it all. And I think I know for myself that what is useful is just acknowledging that, yes, Makgathi, you have this image called desire, called hope, called wish, and it's sitting on one side. And it's important for me to acknowledge that, yes, here is this reality that isn't here now that I am wishing for. But here's also the here and now as it appears, and make space for both without letting go of the here and now in favor of just constantly living in the wish. Because in living in the wish, what happens is that I move away from the here and now. So just by saying okay, this is the longing, this is the wish, this is what I would like, just by acknowledging it, for some reason or I don't know, somehow it creates space in me to say, you can come sit here, but you don't have to shout whilst you sit here. I know you are here, and it's okay that you are here.
That's so beautiful. Imagine if we could treat wish as a boulder.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
it's
yeah.
not like the goal here is to get rid of the boulder or to crush the boulder into soil. It's like, it's a beautiful boulder. It's a big boulder. It's the boulder. It's a, it is what it is. It's a boulder of wish.
Yes.
But we don't have to try and lift it up. We can let it be as a wish thought form, and we can actually, from the perspective of the present moment, of here and nowness, of presencing, of awarenessing, there's an acknowledging that there's this wish thinking. So I don't have to lift it up. I can just let it be. Maybe it's inspiring for me. Maybe it's something I work towards, but I hold it lightly. And so it's the relationship with the wish rather than the wish itself that is going to determine my capacity to be here and my capacity to become lost. If I'm trying to lift up the boulder, the work in that moment is to realize I'm trying to lift up the boulder, not to do anything with the boulder.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds simple enough, isn't it? I think it actually is. It's so simple because if we saw clearly that we were doing that, we would immediately stop doing it.
Yes. Yes.
It wouldn't require a whole lot of analysis and thought and, reading of Buddhist texts and Sufi texts and, going off to retreats in the Himalayas. It wouldn't require any of that. It would be, oh, yeah, okay, that's very obvious.
What we are entranced by this world, aren't we? It's so delicious and perfumey and alluring and, filled with reflection.
And it's also like, let's not mistake that I'll be holding it lightly as we're not engaged and we're not, moved by a boulder, either moved negatively towards like an aversion or moved by a craving or desire. It's like we're humans. So it's like things move us and we want them to move us, but the holding lightly is, that's real skill.
Yeah. 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 It reminds me of an experience I recently had, and I'm going to speak very lightly about it. But that experience of having a smile, having my body be smiled, and having a whole smile deposited into my body, into the entire, and not just my body, even my etheric body, all of me, just beaming with the smile that radiated all around me and inside of me and throughout me, and at the same time having these understandings of the suffering that is inevitable in this world, and seeing myself just be radiant with this light smile, and light as in let's say delight, the illuminated within the space of degradation and suffering and pain, and having the two just be there, and knowing that the invitation is Makgathi, yes, it's there, and you can hold it, but hold it lightly. Don't get entangled in it. Remember, the light is always there, is also there. Because I know that when I am in that space of the deep suffering, I only think that this is all there is, and immediately my impulse is to run away from it. Whereas when I know that there is other capacities, other aspects that make me me, that I can show up, I can call on all these other aspects, and one of them is light. And by calling on the light, I can then just sit and be with the suffering without getting entangled in it. And then perhaps I can wait and listen to that soft, still voice that may give me guidance. This is what your action should be.
Beautiful.
Last words from you, Simon.
Well, maybe one of the qualities that is cultivatable, especially when we start to intentionally make space for or become spacious with or allowing of a difficult state in any given moment, state of body mind, is that there's in the next moments, we don't know exactly when, there's just that much more availability of spaciousness to notice the ordinary. The ordinary fall of light or shade or color or texture or movement or sensation or sound or smell or taste. Because we're not somewhere else trying to pick up a boulder. And these moments of making contact with our senses can lead to a momentary sense of contentment. Like not joy, but like there's this like, it feels not massively, but fairly pleasant to feel the sun on my skin or this taste of fresh ciabatta. And the data seems to show that momentary experience of mini contentment is associated with well-being and good mental health, as opposed to seeking the big joy. So I think that it's beautiful to have these moments of effulgent joy and tempered with micro moments of ordinary everyday contentment.
Wow. And that we have capacity to give to ourselves.
And receive, actually.
And receive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Always more of a channeling, such a shifting conversation. I have spent a beautiful afternoon being gifted with balm that has really soothed a whole lot inside of me. And I hope that you who is listening is equally touched and is equally soothed by what you have heard. Simon, as always, much love, deep gratitude.
Thank you, Makgathi, and love to you.